Good evening and welcome everyone to another edition of Jennifer's Journeys, our armchair travel session. My name is Jennifer Reynolds. I've worked in the cruise industry and onboard cruise ships for a really long time. And I put together these little series of armchair travel sessions so that we can travel remotely, virtually together. This started last month. We've carried on into April, gone to Italy and South America, to the Antarctic through the Panama Canal. Myself, I grew up in Canada. I worked over 18 years living and working on board cruise ships. I love this photograph because it shows my crew jacket, which I still have from the Silver Cloud. But my early years on board cruise ships were part of a duo juggling magic act and running shore excursions. But as I matured, so did my choice in husbands, and that was my oceanographer husband up there. His name is Stuart Nelson, Dr. Stuart Nelson. We traveled the world. We had a chance to really experience a lot of places, and I developed a deep passion and love for history and geography. So with Jennifer's Journeys, a little session, thank you for indulging me and let me take you to a variety of places in and around the world. I've always worked in the travel agent and the travel world, and I always work through my travel agent partners and their consumers, and it's a confusing and difficult world. And I love working with my travel agent partners. That's the part of the business that I've always been involved in. And in many of those years in working with travel agents and travelers, I had a chance to go to Eastern Canada because I grew up in Canada, just outside of Toronto towards Niagara Falls. So for this evening, I wanted to dabble in Eastern Canada, what we in Canada call the Maritimes. We go out west, but you go down east if you're a Canadian. And if you're looking at the Maritime provinces, you may go in by cruise ship. Many ships that are doing transatlantics will either kiss the coast or some of them may come a little further in as well. Others will do a New York to Montreal run, calling into Nova Scotia, where we're going to go tonight, Charlottetown and Prince Edward Island, where we're going to go to next week, down through the St. Lawrence Seaway towards Montreal, even into Lake Ontario, where we will do a journey to next week. But this is where I grew up, my friends. This is Canada. This is my homeland. These are areas that I've been to, and whether you go in by cruise ship, you travel it on your own, take a via rail train out, a guided vacation, rent a motor home, stay with locals, cool hotels. There's a food focus. There's just everything that you could possibly want in the Maritimes. And oh, how this part of the world has grown up. And this is Nova Scotia, the capital. This is Halifax, which is the capital of Nova Scotia, the province. Just under 500,000 people live here, but it's a very interesting place to visit. It's a city, but it's not. It has a feel of a very small town. It's very cultural. It's very learned. There's a large naval base, a tremendous amount of history, and it's a very deep hub of culture. There's a lot of galleries and a very significant tie to the Titanic. And if any of you were with me recently on our talks about the Titanic, you know the role that Halifax and the Canadians played when the Titanic sank. But it was April 1st, 19, it was on April 1st, sorry, the government in Nova Scotia, it was in 1996, not that long ago. They dissolved the city of Halifax and they brought four municipalities together: Halifax, Dartmouth, Bedford, and Halifax County. And that kind of changed the way things were being done over here. But the reality is they were all much better together as a unit as opposed to trying to operate separately. And although that was only in 96 that happened, the administration of that has been significant in the forward thinkingness of Halifax. I do find it kind of interesting, though, that that all took place on April 1st, sort of April Fool's Day. But anyway, let's take a historical look at Canada, what it means to Halifax, what it means to the Maritimers, what it means to those of us that are from Canada, that we forget that we were originally founded by the British government as the town of Halifax in 1749, really new. under the direction and Board of Trade and Plantations, and it was placed under the commander of Governor Edward Cornwallis. The town was named in honor of George Montague Dunk, the second Earl of Halifax, and he was president of the British Board of Trade. With its vast harbor and among the largest natural harbors in the world, Halifax was ideal not only for a military base, but it could be defended on all sides, so it was very ideally located. The location of the new town in Halifax wasn't someplace that was devoid of people when Edward Cornwallis arrived, and that was in 1749. Cornwallis brought along about 1,200 settlers with him and their families. And again, 1749. This was Micmac territory. This was their land. All of Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, and north of the St. John River. A significant part of Quebec's Gaspé Peninsula and northern Maine. This was their turf. They were indigenous and they believed that this land was all theirs. So the new British arrivals quickly set about erecting fortifications in Halifax, notably what you see here, which is Citadel Hill. It only took 5 years, but these British settlers, just 1,200 of them, had extended their reach to Dartmouth, Bedford, all the way down the coast to Lunenburg, and Lawrencetown even further away. Consistent but small attacks on the new British settlements came from the Micmac, and folks weren't too happy about it. The British were more concerned about the potential of a threat by the French at the fort of Louisbourg at Cape Breton. Another source of irritation for the British was the Catholic French Arcadians, the Acadians, seeking to establish an ideal pastoral homeland. Coming mostly from southern France, these people sought to colonize and have their pastoral homeland here. And in the 1600s, they had colonized what they would call Acadia, roughly half of what would become the Canadian provinces of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. Interspersed among them were British settlements, and the Acadians staunchly refused to swear oath of allegiance to Britain. And eventually it happens. What is known as the 7-Year War, although in North America we call it better the French and Indian War, it erupted between the British and the French. Halifax proved its military worth in the 7-Year War. It was both the base for the successful 2-year siege and almost total destruction of the French fortress at Louisbourg in 1760. Today, that fortress has been rebuilt and is beautifully restored, and anyone going to Halifax will often come out here to visit. But fed up with the attitude of the Acadians, the British decided to get rid in Nova Scotia of anyone with French ties. By imperial fiat of the French governor, mass deportation was ordered as to the Acadians. They were brutally expelled from their homelands and property was confiscated. Initially imprisoned on George's Island in Halifax Harbor, the Acadians were forced onto ships and into deportation. The expulsion of the Acadians lasted until about 1762 and forced more than 10,000 people out of their homes. Families were broken up. Acadians who did not cooperate in their own deportation were jailed or sent back to France, in some cases by way of a prison camp. Acadians were also shipped unwillingly down the eastern seaboard to New England, to British colonies that didn't want them, but were forced by London to take them. Some Acadians, after deportation into the British colonies, England, English territories in France, and French territories, found their way into southern Louisiana. And beginning in 1762, they formed their own culture here, and the word Acadian was shortened and Americanized to Cajun. More than 6,000 Acadians were then put on ships and deported, with many eventually arriving in southern Louisiana, and they're known as the Cajuns. Several years after the 7-Year War, many Acadians returned, and their descendants can now be found in the villages throughout Atlantic Canada. The 7-Year War also eliminated any threat of attack from anyone Micmac. With the enlarged British colony of Nova Scotia, more settlers were needed, and handbills were posted throughout Europe encouraging emigration to the New World. Over 2,700, quote, foreign Protestants, unquote, came to Nova Scotia, including Germans, Dutch, New Englanders, and residents of Martinique. Each foreign Protestant had to sign an oath of naturalization. Halifax had become the largest Royal Navy base on the Atlantic coast, and in 1879 the town hosted the largest numbers of British Army regulars. Behind the industry of the merchants and townsfolk was another side of Halifax, the brothels, the drinking dens, the underworld, and it did nourish itself on the vices of the troops in the fleet. Already Halifax was reputed to be one of the most wicked towns in North America. With naval fleets or naval vessels no longer available to carry mail, Halifax merchants banded together in 1765, and they built the Nova Scotia Packet, a schooner to carry mail to Boston. This schooner was later commissioned as the Naval Schooner Halifax, and it was the first warship ever built in eastern Canada. But peacetime in Halifax was in an economic doldrum. The local government didn't have enough money to pay for oil for the Sambro Island Lighthouse, which had been built in 1758. Money was so tight that the local militia was unable to maintain a guard, and they were disbanded. Things were about to get a lot worse. The American Revolutionary War was not at first uppermost in the minds of the residents of Halifax, but at the end of March in 1776, British General William Howe showed up, being driven from Boston by rebel forces. He brought along 200 officers, 3,000 men, and over 4,000 loyalist refugees. He wanted housing and he wanted provisions for all. This was just the beginning of Halifax's role in the war. Thousands more refugees and troops, mostly from New York, arrived in Halifax and other ports in Nova Scotia in a destitute and a helpless condition. Among those arriving in Halifax were the Black Loyalists. Many of them had escaped slavery. They had fought with the British during the Civil War for a chance at freedom. Most of the Black Loyalists in Nova Scotia came out of the port of New York, which was the last port to be evacuated by the British. There were negotiations between Washington and the British whether the blacks would be returned to their masters or whether they would be set free. It was decided that all blacks that had joined the British before or during the war would be given freedom. The British had compiled a book of about 3,000 former slaves who met the criteria. Blacks that came back to Nova Scotia mainly settled in Southville and southern Halifax. With the formal conclusion of America's War of Independence in 1783, tens of thousands of British loyalists from the former American colonies now flooded into Nova Scotia. These loyalists demanded a role in the local control, and as a result, Britain subdivided Nova Scotia in 1784 with the creation of the colonies of New Brunswick and Cape Breton Island. In 1796, Prince Edward, the Duke of Kent, who later would father Queen Victoria, was sent to take command of Nova Scotia. Many of Halifax's forts were designed by him. He left an indelible mark on the city in the form of many public buildings and of the Georgian architecture. To this day, pubs and streets, even islands, are named after him. But it was during this time that Halifax truly became a city. Landmarks and institutions were built during his tenure. The old town clock on Citadel Hill, a gift from Prince Edward, who was obsessed with people being on time. And he also built St. George's Round Church. Fortifications in the Halifax Defense Complex were built up, new businesses were established, and the population absolutely boomed. Although the Duke left in 1800, the city's prosperity continued, especially during the War of 1812. Present-day landmarks such as the Government House, Province House, and the House of Assembly were all constructed during this period of prosperity, which was until about 1812. In the peace that followed in 1815, Halifax at first suffered an economic downturn for a few years, aggravated primarily by the move of the Royal Navy Yard to Bermuda, and that was in 1818. But the economy recovered in the next decade. A lot of local entrepreneurs, including a gentleman named Samuel Cunard and a banker by the name of Enos Collins. Cunard was a British shipping magnate born in Halifax, Nova Scotia, in November 1787. He was the son of a master carpenter and a timber merchant. He settled in Halifax. Sir Samuel founded the famous Cunard line. When Enos Collins died in 1871 at the age of 97, he was said to be the wealthiest man in the new nation of Canada. Collins had made most of his way in a money most of us might find rather strange. He was a privateer, a legal pirate, licensed by the British Crown, who raided French and Spanish ports in the Caribbean during the Napoleonic Wars, and he preyed upon American shipping during the War of 1812, and that's how he made his money. Collins invested his wealth in very respectful and much less violent enterprises, including a private bank. Collins owned warehouse here on Halifax's waterfront, and you would see it if you were there today. Another economic upsurge came about because of the American Civil War. Halifax boomed by playing both sides of the fence. It helped supply the wartime economy on the north, and it also offered refuge and supplies to the Confederate blockade runners. Confederate ships often called on the port to take on supplies and make repairs, although British neutrality laws limited their stay to 24 hours. One ship, the CSS Tallahassee, became a legend in Halifax when she made a daring midnight escape through two northern warships believed waiting at the harbor entrance. After the American Civil War, the 5 colonies that made up British North America, which would be Ontario, Quebec, Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, held meetings and united as a single country on July 1st, 1867. It was the accumulation of years of conferences and government officials, but it happened so very, very quickly. At this point, in 1899, the Port of Halifax is the site of Canada's first overseas military deployment, as the country sends aid to the British Empire during the Second Boer War in South Africa. Canadian Boer War volunteers returned to Canada through the Port of Halifax after successfully aiding the British in the Boer defeat. The crowds that cheered on the volunteers' departure that you see here in 1899 celebrated the return of the first Canadian contingent in 1901 with parades and with concerts. In fact, a Boer War Memorial statue is located on the grounds, and this is in downtown Halifax. Wonderful book from that period of time, if you're interested at all, called The Power of One, written by Bryce Courtney. Terrific story about the Boer War. But Halifax's location just off the Great Circle route made it very close to Europe for any of the mainland North American ports. Haligonians, which is what someone from Halifax is called, wanted to make the city's natural harbor Canada's official winter port and gateway for trade with Europe. But this brought the port into commercial conflict with the IRC, the Intercolonial Railway. It was completely owned and controlled by the federal government, and it was one of the first crown corporations. Interestingly, most Canadian exporters sent their wares by train through Boston or even as far down to Portland to then pick up ships and be sent overseas. It took World War I to at last boost Halifax Harbor into prominence as both a world-class port and a naval facility. The strategic location of the port with its protective waters served as an assembly point for convoys safe from German U-boat attacks before the convoys headed out into the open Atlantic Ocean. Halifax was also the departure port of Canadian soldiers heading overseas, and most Canadian troops left from Halifax on board enormous peacetime ocean liners converted to troop ships, such as the Mauretania or the Olympic. The Mauretania saw service both as a troop ship, and here she is with her dazzle paint. She also was a hospital ship, and here you see the Olympic. But Halifax's railway connections with the Intercolonial Railway of Canada and its port facilities was vital to the British war effort during World War I. And this area became Canada's industrial center, and it churned out a huge quantity of materials for the Western Front. Indeed, a new generation of gun battery, searchlights, anti-submarine were defending the Halifax harbor. The war is seen as a boon for the economy, but all of that changed on the morning of December 6th, 1917. And that began with the French munitions ship called the Mont Blanc. She left her anchorage outside the mouth of the harbor to join a convoy gathering in Bedford Basin. Mont Blanc was loaded with 2,300 tons of wet and dry picric acid, 200 tons of TNT, 10 tons of gun cotton, and a whole bunch of high-octane fuel. Everything she was carrying on board, including 300 rounds of live ammunition, were all a very highly explosive mix. At the same time, the Norwegian vessel IMO that you see here in ballast was set off from the basin she was getting ready from New York Harbor. At the entrance to the Narrows, the IMO struck the Mont Blanc. And although the collision wasn't severe, the fire immediately broke out on board the Mont Blanc. The captain, the pilot, and the crew, expecting the ship to blow up, immediately launched the lifeboats, and they took refuge on the Dartmouth shore. The Mont Blanc burned for 20 minutes, drifting until it rested against Pier 6 at the end of Halifax Harbor. The spectacle of the burning ship was thrilling and drew crowds of spectators unaware of the danger. Only the Mont Blanc's crew knew. A handful of naval officers and railway dispatcher knew of the Mont Blanc's explosive cargo, and there was little time to spread any kind of a warning. The railway dispatcher, his name was Vincent Coleman. He worked at the station at the railway yards just a few hundred feet from Pier 6. That's where the burning Mont Blanc had drifted ashore. Vincent quickly turned to his telegraph key to stop any incoming trains. His message read, "Hold up the trains. Munition ship on fire and making for Pier 6. Goodbye, boys." He was killed in the explosion, but his message was heard by every station from Halifax to Truro, alerting the Canadian government and the railway to the problem. Thanks to Vincent's message, the Canadian railway system responded quickly to the disaster and sent relief trains with medical help to the ravaged city. Vincent Coleman's body and belongings were later recovered, and he was named a hero for his quick thinking. It was just before 9:05 a.m. that the Mont Blanc exploded. Not one piece of her remained beside Pier 6. Fragments rained down on the surrounding area, crashing through buildings with enough force to embed them where they landed. Fragments from the Mont Blanc landed 3 miles away from the explosion site. It was the largest man-made explosion before the first testing of an atomic bomb, and it is still one of the largest non-nuclear man-made explosions. Churches, houses, schools, factories, docks, ships were destroyed. Children who had stopped on their way to school, workmen lining in the windows, families in their homes. The massive explosion and fire that followed devastated a large part of Halifax. The official count listed 1,963 people killed, another 9,000 injured, 12,000 houses and buildings damaged, and 6,000 Haligonians left homeless. The IMO's captain, pilot, and 5 crew members were killed. All from the Mont Blanc survived, apart from one man who later died of his wounds. News of the disaster reached Boston the same morning. That very night, a train loaded with supplies, together with medical personnel and members of the Boston Red Cross and the Massachusetts Public Safety Committee, left for Halifax. As a thank you to the city of Boston for its rapid response, the city of Halifax sent Boston a Christmas tree in 1918. In 1971, the city of Halifax began a practice of sending a Christmas tree annually to Boston, partially as a thank you for the rapid relief, and partially to commemorate and encourage commerce between the two cities. Following day, after the explosion, a blizzard hit and dumped 16 inches of snow on this already devastated city. Immediately, help rushed in from all over Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island. An official inquiry opened up after less than a week after the explosion, and on an appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada, both ships were judged equally at fault. Thus, no blame was ever laid in the largest man-made explosion until the atomic age. Many gravestones, artifacts, and monuments in the cities of Halifax and Dartmouth are reminders of the explosion. But the explosion and the rebuilding which followed had important impacts on the city. It reshaped the layout of neighborhoods. It created progressive housing developments here like Hydrastone. But Halifax was not immune to the Great Depression, and the failure of industries and unemployment brought very hard times. Halifax played an even bigger role in the Allied naval war of World War II. Halifax became a lifeline for preserving Britain during the Nazi onslaught of the Battle of Britain and the Battle of the Atlantic, of holding supplies, and the supplies helping to offset the threatened amphibious invasion of Germany. Many convoys assembled in Halifax's Bedford Basin. They delivered supplies to troops in Europe. The city's railway links fed large numbers of troop ships, building up Allied armies in Europe. And as a young girl, I recall my father and his stories about boarding ships in Halifax to go overseas. Wartime rumors told of German U-boats entering Halifax harbor, so she was always very, very well protected. The war was also let me rephrase it. The war marked yet another massive explosion in Halifax. And this time it was the Bedford Naval Armament, and it blew up on July 18, 1945. It caused the evacuation of the entire north end of Halifax and Dartmouth, and it just spread another panic. They had been to this rodeo before. There was a huge economy slump after the war. Reconstruction from the Bedford explosion brought new housing and new infrastructures, but urban renewal plans in the 1960s and the 1970s resulted in a huge loss of much of Halifax's heritage, of their architectural, and a large portion of the downtown development, such as Scotia Square, that you see here, were ultimately lost. Another casualty during the 1960s and 70s, during this period of expansion of urban renewal, was an area of the Black community called Africville. This picture shows Africville during the 1960s and its location on Bedford Basin, with North End Halifax and the Narrows in the background. Some 400 people resided in Africville, and many could trace their legacy to the Blacks that had joined with the British Loyalists during the American Revolution. Africville never benefited from municipal services. They never received water nor sewer services provided to other Halifax residents. For their water supply, they relied on an assortment of wells. Life in Africville tended to be focused around the African United Baptist Church. For the government, it was relatively easy to declare Africville a slum, and once done, the community was demolished and its residents forcefully displaced. In the end, many citizens were shipped off to slum housing. Their personal belongings were transported in city garbage trucks. Bulldozers were sent in during the night to level the community, and not only houses, but stores, businesses, and even ultimately the church. Property claims were in chaos. Only a family of families could establish any kind of a legal title. Others claimed squatters' rights. Others were given less than $500 in compensation. Most of the residents were relocated to public housing in Mulgrave Park in Halifax, and the total cost of the expropriation was just under $1 million. In 1968, the relocation was proclaimed a success and the last building was bulldozed in 1970. Much of the land on which Africville once stood became a park. Now there is a monument the shape of a sundial that has the names of the early black settlers. But Africville did not go quietly into the night. A replica of the African United Baptist Church was dedicated in September 2011 as the Africville Church Museum. Its construction and exhibits were funded as part of a $3 million agreement between the Halifax Regional Municipality and the Africville Genealogy Society. While urban growth had spurred offshore oil, natural gas, and lots of economic activity, much has been due to the population shift from rural Nova Scotia into Halifax proper. To sum up what ended up happening and what they needed to do to make a change over here, the Halifax Regional Municipality was created in 1996. These municipal governments came together. They felt they were stronger together. The cities of Halifax, of Dartmouth, of Bedford, the county of Halifax, and even Sable Island, which is 100 miles off the coast. But it's significant and it has allowed the city to move forward. Halifax Citadel National Site is the most visited historic site in Canada, believe it or not. Built between 1828 and 56 as a fort from which to safeguard the British Navy. Phenomenal views just on the edge of the city and a wonderful, wonderful spot for a picnic. The monument, the only monument in North America to the Crimean War, 1854 to 1855. Pier 21, all of this within walking distance downtown in this compact little area that holds only 400,000 people. Akin to Ellis Island, Pier 21 is the last immigration shed left in Canada, and the museum here tells the story of the immigrants who entered Canada by way of this wharf. Historic properties, lots of breweries, lots of restaurants here, the Halifax Public Gardens, right in the heart of the city, the Victorian Public Gardens. The statues and things in 1867, the year of my country's Confederation. Really, really, really nice spot to visit. The Art Gallery of Nova Scotia features artwork by Canadian artists. Another favorite spot here is Trident Bookstores. Look these guys up online. They've been around forever. You can get a book, have a cup of coffee, enjoy the locals. It's a really neat local spot, all in the historic waterfront area. The Maritime Museum along the waterfront, there's so much rich maritime history here. There's a deck chair from the Titanic. It tells the maritime history. There are exhibits and items from the Mackay Bennett, which is the ship that participated in the recovery efforts of the Titanic. Food's amazing, tons of places to dine. Food trucks have been making their living here for a really, really long time. There's a neat little casino. You got to walk up down Barrington Street. And in all the years I lived on ships, I spent half of my time whenever we went to Eastern Canada looking for Lay's potato chips, ketchup flavored, my friends, crunchy bars in Canada, and lastly, Swiss Chalet chicken, because that was just such a really, really Canadian thing to do. The Seaport Farmers Market, where a lot of locals do and get their local produce. And Seaport Market is also a showcase, food-wise, for many of the local culinary and markets, which is really nice to see. Population of about 400,000 people, as I mentioned earlier. St. Paul's Church here is the oldest building in Halifax, and it was 1749. But it's the Titanic, and it was 2012 marked the 100th anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic. And the facts surrounding the Titanic and the sinking are generally well known, but Halifax played a very significant role in the aftermath of that tragedy. And that legacy is in the graves of the Titanic victims in the cemetery. At the non-denominational Fairview Lawn Cemetery are 121 bodies. Another 19 are buried at the Roman Catholic Mount Olive Cemetery, and 10 more are in the Jewish cemetery. Peggy's Cove. Getting out of the downtown area and exploring some of the most picturesque things you will ever see, not too far away depending on traffic. Home to only 36 people, Peggy's Cove Lighthouse, built in 1915, is considered to be the best known symbol, the best icon known of Eastern Canada. The fishing boats, the lobster, the homes, the village is also home to the famous sculptor Degarth. He died in 1983. You can see his gallery here, and he has some sculptures that you can also visit that are honoring the Nova Scotia fishermen, their families, and the part that fishing plays to the economy. But amidst the beauty of Peggy's Cove, there was also a tragedy. On September 2nd, 1998, Swissair Flight 111 crashed into St. Margaret's Bay. One of the two memorials to the passengers and crew is at the promontory, not too far away here from Peggy's Cove. Beautiful city is Halifax, yet there is a tremendous amount of mystery. There's a tremendous amount of imagination, and some of you may have heard about it in the form of Oak Island. It's just off the southern shore of Nova Scotia, about 50 miles down the coast from Halifax. It's not uncommon at all for someone to include a visit to Halifax and pop over here. The tree-covered, privately owned, 140-acre Oak Island is one of about 360 small islands in this bay. Rises to above 36 feet above sea level. It's only 660 feet from shore, and it's connected by a causeway that was built in the 1960s. For more than 200 years, Oak Island has been the site of treasure hunting, and it's popularly referred to as the Money Pit. An apparently man-made shaft is rumored to lead to all kinds of amazing treasures, and many of them are at the bottom. So far, excavation of the Money Pit has claimed 6 lives, but here's what's rumored to be at the bottom. Private treasure buried by Captain Kidd, possibly even Blackbeard. The treasury of the fortress of Louisbourg, buried by the French army and engineers after the fortress wall fell to the British, is said to be here. The priceless jewels of Marie Antoinette secreted away by one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting when the Palace of Versailles was stormed by revolutionaries. It's said that later the French Navy brought the jewels to Oak Island. The Knights Templar. It's been asserted that the pit may have been dug by exiled Knights Templar, and it may be the last resting place of the Holy Grail, or even the Holy Ark of the Covenant. Hard to say, but it's another place that you can visit in Halifax, in Nova Scotia, and in my home country of Canada. Next, we're going to go over to Prince Edward Island, also aptly named after a Brit. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 7 p.m., join me for our Jennifer's Journeys. We're coming to a close. Now it's Prince Edward Island. Then we're going to come down the St. Lawrence Seaway into the Great Lakes, and then we'll have one more session on May 1st. This is Jennifer Reynolds. Thank you so much for joining me for our Jennifer's Journeys. Know that these sessions are always recorded and available on Jennifer Reynolds Travels, both on Facebook and YouTube. And don't forget to visit our friends at www.collagetravelradio.com. To travel is to live, and to live is to travel. #TravelStrong. This is Jennifer Reynolds. Thanks for joining.